Okay, Wednesday night. I don't know what day it is. 15th? 15th. Oh, that was good. July 15th, 7 p.m. Wednesday night Bible study. We are in the 19th chapter of Matthew. Um, so, what's been happening in our story so far? Although although Matthew didn't record it, uh, Mark and Luke and John did, and that they brought the woman who caught in adultery to Jesus. Now, she was caught in the very act of adultery. Somehow, because she's a miracle woman, but they brought her. They had been apparently setting some sort of trap. You don't accidentally catch someone in the act of adultery. So, because they're looking for an excuse to get out of a marriage, and one rabbi had said, so this is Hillel and Shammai are two very prominent rabbis who during this time period are opposites. One is saying they're very lenient. You can get out of um, your marriage for any reason, any uncleanness that you find with the woman, whatever uncleanness means. He's very loose on it. And the other rabbi was, no, it's only adultery. Of course, God's not like trying to get people to get divorced, but the men were. The men were. They were very excited that they could get married and then just get out of it whenever they felt like it. But they had to. In some cases, they felt like, no, we've got it. It's got to be adultery. In other cases, it could just be anything. So they bring this woman to Jesus. You know, she's caught in the act of adultery. So therefore, he's going to say yes, and I pronounce the divorce, but he didn't. He forgave her. He said, no, yeah. And that bugged them. So they come to him, and when we catch up with them, uh, what Matthew records is they're asking Jesus about divorce because he didn't tell the woman, and now you're going to get divorced. So they want to know, which side do you stand on? Uh, Jesus is very aware of what's going on and what they're looking and how they're looking to trap him and get him to come down on one side or the other so that somebody could be mad at him. And as far as Jesus is concerned, you can all be mad at me. I'm just going to tell you the truth. And he's basically saying, here's why the law is given. And let's remind ourselves Moses gave the law because they needed desperately to know what was right and wrong. It wasn't after 400 years of Egypt living, they had no clue what God considered right and what God considered wrong. They had no clue because there's no Bible. So in fact, there wasn't a Bible until Moses started recording Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. Once they, got over into the wilderness. So all they have are these stories that they were passing down, and then the Egyptians and how they lived. So when they got into the wilderness, they were pretty nuts. Not under and God had to say, "Thou shalt not murder," and they're like, "What? You can't murder?" I mean, this is news to them. He had to lay it down, and then he had to give a very strict penalty for it in order to discourage them because it's just human nature. So, and I think last week I was kind of giving the example. You've got that toddler who's pulling things down and seeing a knife and oh it's pretty and seeing fire and sometimes you have to like no and slap that hand really hard so that they know oh that's a really horrible penalty for doing that because just saying no stop no that they don't hear that so they have to know if I reach over and grab that pretty fire it's going to really I'm going to get a really so no I don't want to do that and so God get now obviously as you mature Mama don't need to spank your hand. You understand why fire is bad for you, and you understand what. So you don't have to get the same sort of punishment. But Moses, when the law was originally given, if you do this, stone them to death. If you do this, you got to kill them. So that they would learn. No, do not do that. Now, now the law is written in our hearts, and the Bible talks about that. I'm going to circumcise your heart. So we don't need, the penalty of catching on fire in order to stop it. The Holy Spirit is able to stop us and talk to us and reason with us, and we're able to grow. So it's not the same sort of penalties now. But in Moses' day, that's what it was. You commit adultery and you stone this woman, and that's what they wanted Jesus to fall on one side or the other, or they wanted him to say, "Hey, get divorced. It's no big deal." And Jesus wasn't going to let him wasn't going to let him catch them. And so in Matthew chapter 9, it says, he saith unto them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you to put away your wives. But from the beginning was not so. He says he granted divorce because if it was like, you cannot get divorced for any reason, then the men were going to kill their wives. Because something's wrong with you, of course, he said, yes, but he's saying that's not the goal. The goal is you can marry and divorce. But that's what they were doing. Because since it was so easy to divorce, since all you had to do is say, I divorce thee, I divorce thee, I divorce thee 3 times, and just hand them a letter saying, I divorce you. And it was that simple. You can get married and divorced, married and divorced. It's like nothing. It's like nothing. And that's how they treated it. I used to say, if cars only cost $5, then when you get mad at somebody, you would ram your car into them, or you would, people have this road rage thing. But fortunately, cars are really expensive, and that's what stops us from doing it. But if you make anything like really easy, people just, and so they made divorce so easy. People just get married, divorce, married, divorce. He's trying to say that's not really the goal. I understand there are circumstances, obviously, when the situation is so intense, it calls for a divorce. But in their cases, that's not why they were getting divorced. There wasn't these intense situations where everybody would go, yeah, it was just whatever. She burnt the matzah. And so, and then, and really, to be honest, they were just attracted to somebody else and I like her now, I like her now, so I'll just come up with some fake reason to get divorced, and then I'll marry her. And then when I'm tired of her, I'll come up with some fake reason to get divorced and marry somebody else. So he's saying that's not how God intended it. He intended people to come together and stay. And that's our goal. Our goal is not to see how many times we can get divorced, but our goal is to see if we can stay married. That's the goal. And he wants that because he wants us to learn. God's saying, this is how I stick with you when you mess up, when you fall down, when you do. I stick with you. And you need a model on this earth so that you'll understand my relationship with you. Again, people don't have their Bibles. They're not reading their Bibles every day. They're not going to church. These things don't exist. So God's giving them physical models so that they can see what it is that how he operates. So he creates marriage so they can understand, see how you stick through thick and thin, and that's how I am with you. I will not give up with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. And if you don't see some sort of model of that on this earth, your mind will be able to comprehend it. And that's how we are. It's hard for us to rise above. It's difficult for us to rise above our earthly examples of relationships to figure out how God is. So if our parents abandoned us or whatever, we think God's going to abandon us. A lot of times we just reflect onto God what we have witnessed and experienced. So he wanted them to experience the ideal commitment. And these guys were looking for the opposite. So in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, he says, and I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife except it be for fornication and shall marry another, he's committing adultery. So you want to stone this woman for adultery. You want to put her to death for adultery, but you're committing adultery when you just, you didn't like the toast. And so you divorced your wife. And because he wants to know, so if you want to kill everybody for adultery, then you guys have to line up and I'll just start stoning you one at a time. Because all the things that you've done and all the flimsy reasons you've come up with for divorce, you're committing adultery too. And so I'm not saying Jesus is in favor of adultery. He's trying to put it all equal. He says it's all equal to God. You've committed to somebody and then you just found some flimsy reason to leave them. But in God's eyes, that's still, if you just leave somebody over that you didn't like how they polished your shoes, in God's eyes, you're still married. And when you go off with that other person, that's adultery. So if you want to start stoning people for adultery, you're in it. And then he goes on to say, and whoever marries her, which is put away, you're committing adultery too. So if you just say, hey, divorce your wife, then I'll marry her, that's adultery too. So if we're killing people for adultery, come on, let's do it. So that was scary. Like, uh-oh, so we can't just, because marriage was like, yeah, I'll get married at 13 because I know I can get divorced at 14 and I can get married again at 15 and divorce again at 16. So marriage was like no big deal in those days to the men. But when Jesus said, actually, you shouldn't be just getting married and divorced, married, divorced, married, divorced, that's not how it was written. In Matthew chapter 19, verse 10, his disciples said to him, well, in the case of the man, be so with his wife. It's not good to marry. Like if men are like stuck with their wives, then ooh, that's maybe it's not good to marry. So here's what Jesus says in verse 11. But he said to him, well, all men cannot receive this saying, save they to whom it is given. So he didn't say, no, don't be silly. He said, well, maybe some of you shouldn't get married, but everybody can receive that. Only to who some people might have a special gift. And Paul was talking about this, like you don't need to get married. You don't have those same needs as everybody else. But only a few men, Jesus is saying, the rest of you are just gonna have to get married and deal with it and learn to forgive and learn all the stuff that marriage teaches you. But some people, he says, actually, marriage is not for you and you probably shouldn't do it, right? So there's some who've been given that in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul's kind of talking about this because Paul wasn't married. Now, when you read the adventures of Paul in the chapter of Acts, you know why. Because he was crazy. And nobody could be married to Paul. And Paul wasn't interested in marriage. He was married to God. I'm married to God. And he was on fire and he was crazy all the time. And Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 7, for I would that all men were even as I am. But every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner, another after this. So I wish be great if everybody was like me, because they're asking Paul, should we get married? Should we not get married? What do you think? And he says, it'd be great if but everybody has their different gift. I'm able to not do it, and it's not a problem. But for some of you others, you need to go ahead and get married. Uh, in fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 9, is that if you cannot contain yourself, because Paul says, I'm okay, then let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn. Like you if it's going to make you crazy and I need, then you need to go ahead and get married. Okay, God's not calling for you. And here's that's the interesting thing. He says in ministry, um, uh, some people think, some denominations, of which will remain nameless, they want all their ministers to not be married. But the Bible's saying that's a gift that some people have and some people don't have that gift. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5, Paul is saying, hey, because they're saying, Paul, you shouldn't ask for money and you shouldn't do this and you shouldn't do that. And they're treating Paul differently than the other apostles. The other apostles are giving offerings to, and they're saying, they're like, Paul, you're different. And Paul says, now have we not power to lead about a sister, a wife, as well as other apostles? I mean, when they go on their journeys, they take their sister, their wives with them. We could do that, if we were married, and you'd have to give enough money for both of us. When Silas and I travel, we don't take anybody with us, so we're not asking you for as much money. You're supporting Peter's ministry because he says the other apostles and he mentions Peter specifically, and Cephas, and that's Peter. You support him and his wife. Now Peter's just as ministers as Paul is. Peter and Paul, they're both ministers. Peter's married and he's ministering. Paul is not married and he's ministering, which is what Paul was saying. People have different gifts. So you shouldn't put something on somebody. But there's a denomination that they want everybody. If you're a minister, you can't be married. And the Bible just never said that. It's so odd. I don't know how people come up with things. I wish they would read the whole Bible before they just make something up. So Peter's a minister and he's married. Paul's ministry is not married. So why would you say none of you ministers can be married? Because that's okay. Like, okay, I won't get married, but you'll be sorry. So if you're not able to do that, then God's not calling for you to do that. God's not impressed with you. I didn't get married. Okay, yeah, but then you terrorized everyone, so you should have gotten married. So Jesus is saying, because when they sing to Jesus, ooh, Maybe you shouldn't get married. Well, maybe some of you shouldn't, but most of you should, Peter. Um, going back to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he says, brethren, let every man, this is verse 24. Brethren, let every man wherein he is called therein abide with God. Like however you were called, stay that way. Because they asked him about widows and virgins, and if I'm married, should I stay married? If I'm not married, should I get married? Paul's like, wherever God has called you, stay there. God's not impressed if you have 15 wives. He's not impressed if you have no wives. He's impressed if you're doing what he called you to do. Whatever he called God to do, you got to do that. That's the only thing in the presence of God. Verse 25 says, now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord. That's the only reason why, if you respect Paul, he didn't make stuff up. I don't have any commandment of the Lord, whether virgins are supposed to stay virgins or I don't know. He said, yet I can give you my judgment, but it's not a commandment, as one that hath obtained mercy from the Lord to be faithful. So God's been merciful to me, and I'm able to be faithful to him, and it's not a problem. He says, I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress. Now, the church is being attacked, and people have to be ready to run at any moment because the Romans, and they're kind of wiping out the Jews, and they're starting to wipe out the Christians. And this was a really bad time. So he says, as far as this present distress, maybe it's not good to plan a big wedding. We're kind of going through that now. Maybe this is not the time. Maybe you should wait if you're planning a big wedding, you know. I say that it is good for a man to be so. So, you know, because of all this crazy stuff that's going on right now, if you're not married, don't get married. If you are married, stay married. He said, that's my only word on it. But basically, my word is, Paul is saying, just however you are, just be that way. And if God doesn't call you to get married, don't get married. If God doesn't call you to stay single, don't stay single. Whatever's in you, follow that. Matthew chapter 19, verse 12. So Jesus is going to say, and he mentions three types of eunuchs. He says, for there are some eunuchs which were so born from their mother's womb. And there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men. And there be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. So this is three situations, not their choice, against their choice, and by their choice. Not their choice. You were born that way. There are some eunuchs. Now, the eunuchs were the people. The word eunuch literally means to make up the bed. And there were men who, for the queens and the princesses, were in their bed chambers, got to be in their bed chambers, and would take care of their beds and be in their beds with the women. And you were going to get in trouble if that was interesting to you. If you're like, ooh, I'm here with the women, and if that was really interesting to you, it's like, you can't be in there then. So they could only have eunuchs in there because they didn't want any problems. So they would castrate some men, then there would be no problem. Yeah, you can be with my wife all day long. And so they were, you can make up her bed all day long. I'm not worried about you hopping in it. Now, Jesus says, there are some eunuchs who were born from mother's womb. They just, no sexual desire at all. He's not mad at them. He's not saying that's bad or good. He says, there's some that God made them that way. They had no choice. He says, there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs, actually castrated so they could work in that position. He says, there's some eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. They've made that choice. I am going to. Those struggle. The ones who are just born that way, they're not struggling with it. It's easy for them. And there's other ones who are, I'm going to make myself a eunuch because God wants me to not ever get married, and I'm going to. Okay, so that's fine. They're doing it for God's sake, but just know that you're going to have a struggle. Because when Peter's saying, none of us get married, Jesus looking at Peter like, Peter, please. You married with all these kids. You couldn't last. Okay. But anyway, so he's just saying everybody has their own gift. Everybody has their own gift. Here's an interesting passage in Isaiah 56, and maybe we can understand it a little better in light of the lesson. In Isaiah chapter 56, verse 3 through 5, it says, neither let the son of the stranger that hath joined himself to the Lord speak, saying, the Lord hath utterly separated from his people. So if the stranger is the foreigner, the alien, the immigrant who's now living with the Jews, um, it shouldn't be a situation where the people are rejecting that person and saying, you're not one of us. You don't live here. You're not, we're rejecting you. He shouldn't be able to, he shouldn't say the Lord hath utterly separated from his people. That shouldn't come out of his mouth. That we shouldn't have that kind of situation. If this person who loves the Lord and they're coming in, then they're part of us now. They're us. Neither let the eunuch say, behold, I'm just a dry tree. Meaning his attitude shouldn't be, I'm like a tree with no fruit on it. I have no purpose in life. I have no desires. I have nothing. And so God can't use me. He said, you're not a dry tree if you're a eunuch and you're born that way. For thus says the Lord unto the eunuchs that keep my Sabbath and choose the things that please me and take hold of my covenant. If you keep my Sabbath and you are obedient to me, and he says, even unto them will I give mine house, and within my walls a place and a name better than the sons and of the daughters. So however you come in to the kingdom of God, you may not be like other people, but God has a place for you. God has a gift for you. God has a work for you. If you're a eunuch, don't say, "Oh, I'm just a dry old tree." God can use you. God can use everybody. He can use everybody. We all have different gifts. He says, "So I'll have something for you, even better than the sons and daughters of the ones who've been here naturally." He's saying that same thing to the alien, to the foreigner, to the immigrant. Uh, God has something for you. If God's bringing you in, and this is back in Isaiah's day before he had actually literally opened up the church to the Gentiles. He's preparing them for the fact that it's not just about you, Jews. It's not just about you, church. That God has something for everybody. So he's preparing them for opening up their doors. He had to keep them separate for a long time because they were crazy, and he had to train them how to act and how to believe in God, and he had to keep them away from other people. But that was just for training purposes. Eventually, they were to go out into the world, and so you might keep somebody in your little private school for training purposes. But now that it's time for them to go out, you take some in the medical school for training purposes. But then now it's time to be a doctor and go out into the world. So he kept them separate, but he was preparing them like pretty soon I'm going to open the borders and we're going to welcome the whole world. So I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. So Jesus is simply extending what God had already said through Isaiah about the eunuch. You've got a special place, and if that's your calling, cool. But Peter, if that's not your calling, then just learn to get along with your wife, because you're not called to be single. And in the second part of verse 12 of chapter 19, he says, he that is able to receive it, let him receive it, but not you. No, not you, I added. So you just need to learn to get along with people. Your solution is not saying I divorced three times and then going on to the next 5 wives. You need to learn how to deal. Okay, Matthew chapter 19, verse 13. Then they were brought unto him little children, that he should put hands on them and pray. So this is a tradition as far as you looking at someone who's you consider holy or sanctified and having them pray over your children. It started in Exodus chapter 13, verse 2. It says, sanctify unto me all the firstborn, whatsoever openeth the womb among the children of Israel, both of man and of beasts, it is mine. So whatever the firstborn, sanctify that to me. Your firstborn child, the firstborn cow, the firstborn lamb, it's mine. Just give that to me and devote that to me. So this is tradition that you would bring the firstborn to the Lord. Now he's trying to train them. Again, they don't all have personal Bibles. In fact, there's only just one Bible. In fact, at this time, there's no Bible. So he has to give them physical examples that teach them about himself. The firstborn belongs to the Lord, and the firstborn became the priest of the family. So the firstborn, if you were firstborn, you were to take care of and minister and go to God on behalf of your younger brothers and sisters. And you were the priest of your family whenever you finally got married and you had kids. The firstborn was the priest. This is before now Aaron, who became a priest, Moses' brother, and that ultimately superseded that they had priests who were specifically assigned to the temple. But the firstborn in every family, you were the priest for your family, to the kids. And he was teaching them that Jesus ultimately is going to be the firstborn of many brethren. We call him the firstborn, and he's our priest. And again, God would just come up with physical, literal examples to teach them something they could point to and see a real living of a truth about the Messiah. Since they didn't have magazines and books, they didn't have television, they couldn't, turn on Robert Schuller. So he had to give them literal examples. So bring me the firstborn. So this was like a tradition. In fact, this is what happened with this. Mary and Joseph were doing this in Luke chapter 2, verse 27. Right after Jesus was born, you had 8 days, and you had to bring him and have him circumcised and dedicated to the Lord. So in Luke chapter 2, verse 27, they had brought Jesus as a baby to the temple, and Simeon was outside, and Simeon comes inside. Simeon's just this holy guy who God would speak to. My wife would say he had the shinin. Yeah. The Shining, that's Jack Nicholson. So God would just speak to him and tell him stuff. So in verse 27, it says, and he came by the Spirit into the temple, and when the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him after the custom of the law, so they had brought him into the temple. They brought Jesus in to be circumcised, to be prayed over, because he was their firstborn. Simeon says, then he took him up in his arms, and he blessed God. Now you wanted a holy man to bless your baby, and so he prayed, but he praised God first, and then he blessed the baby. Here's why: because God had said, "I'm going to let you live until you see the Messiah," and sure enough, God spoke to him. He was led by the Spirit in the temple at the same time. And, it's the Messiah. So first he blesses God. He says, Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace. Now I can die in peace, according to thy word. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation, which thou hast prepared before the face of all people. Now he's prophesying to the child. You be a light to lighten the Gentiles and the glory of thy people Israel. And Joseph and his mother marveled at those things which were spoken of him, because you expected some sort of prophecy over your child. The holy people did that, and they would tell the truth. Today we wouldn't tell the truth, but in the old days they would tell the truth. A holy man would take your baby and say, this baby's a mess, your life's going to be hell, and then hand him back, and he'd walk away. Or they'd say, this baby's going to bless a lot of people, but they would tell the truth. Today we'd be mad, right, if somebody told us the truth about our children. Ooh, this baby, child, prison, I see it. We wouldn't like that. So now we just have babies, and then we pray and bless them, and Lord, they're going to lead thousands to you, and we just pray these wonderful and phenomenal prayers that coming from our brains. But what if we really listened to God and really prophesied over that child? We'd be a mess. Okay, so like in Genesis chapter 48, Joseph takes his kids to his dad, Jacob, right? Israel. And he has 2 kids, Ephraim and Manasseh. Manasseh's the oldest, Ephraim's the youngest. So it says in Genesis chapter 48, verse 13, Joseph took them both, Ephraim in the right hand toward Israel's left hand. So he says, okay, I'm going to aim you toward his left hand, because the left hand's not the good one. And then I'm going to aim Manasseh toward Israel's right hand. And he brought them near unto him, and Israel stretched out his right hand and laid him at Ephraim's head. He just switched him up, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, and guided his hands wittingly, like he did it on purpose. For Manasseh was the firstborn, and he knew, but he switched it up on him, because people used to in the old days listen to God. And verse 18 says, and Joseph said to his father, not so, my father. No, but this is my first. You're switching it up. Remember how in Exodus it says, bring your firstborn to the Lord. I'm bringing you to my firstborn. Well, God's not stuck in that. God was using that whole idea of the firstborn because he's trying to teach people about Jesus. He's going to be the firstborn. But just because you're the firstborn doesn't mean that God has a better blessing for the nextborn or the nextborn or the nextborn. That's how they interpreted it. If you're the firstborn, that means that. Now, the firstborn in any household, you're supposed to watch over your brothers and sisters. That's not like a weird thing. You're the oldest. So that's basically, you're the priest of the household, but it doesn't mean God has something better for you than the others. It doesn't mean have anything worse for you. It depends on you. God has for you what you deserve. So he brings the firstborn to just the dad, and the dad switches up on him. And verse 18, Joseph said to his father, "Not so, my father, for this is the firstborn. Put thy right hand upon his head." And the father refused and says, "I know it, my son. I know it. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his seed shall become a multitude of nations," which is what happened. Manasseh was okay, but when they went into the promised land, it was Ephraim's tribe that formed northern Israel and dominated it. And all these kings came out of Ephraim. Joseph, not Joseph, Caleb and Joshua. Joshua was from the tribe of Ephraim. And Joshua, when they finally led the people into the promised land, Joshua, he's tribe of Ephraim, he went and conquered this mountain and that mountain, just like he said he was going to do, even though he's 80 years old. And his family prospered, and kings came out of him, just like he prophesied. Manasseh, they kind of slipped off to the side. Yeah, they were a people, and they had, but so he told the truth. He told the truth. People didn't. You can't handle the truth, but God knows what's going to happen. He doesn't want us to lie. In Genesis chapter 27, you have his daddy, Abraham, Isaac. Isaac is about to pray over Jacob and Esau. And again, the firstborn is supposed to be prayed over first. So Jacob says to Esau, his firstborn, and he said to him, "Behold, now I'm old, and I know not the day of my death." But he's saying, but it's coming soon, right? So in Genesis chapter 27, verse 3, he says, "Now therefore take, I pray thee, thy weapons, thy quiver, thy bow, go out to the field, and take me some venison. Shoot me down some meat, and make me a nice stew, and come back here, and I will bless you." He says, "And make me savory meat, such as I love, and bring it to me, that I may eat, that my soul may bless thee before I die." So, of course, while he was out there doing that, Jacob tricked him. Now, here's what's funny, because you can't trick God. So even though he prayed over Jacob, and God had already prophesied that the older would serve the younger when they were born, because when they were struggling in the womb, and that means that we are who we are even in the womb. And Jacob was wrestling, and Jacob was trying to come out first when they were born, and the mama knew something was up. And we are who we are. And some of us have the calmest babies, and that's who they are. Some of us have more emotional babies, and that's who they are. And it's not bad or good. We are all just different. Babies that, some babies just go to everybody, and some babies like, you look crazy. And that's who they are their whole lives. They don't just run to everybody. And some people are stupid like me. They just run to everybody. "Oh, hi, Hitler. How you doing?" So, because we don't have that sort of warning system, but never did. You are who you are as a child. You are as young, and that's okay. God protects you, and God does. It's fine. So when they were born, the mama already knew the older was going to serve the younger. So they worked it out that Jacob got Esau's blessing, but that God doesn't care about that. That God, you can't trick God. God was going to do what he's going to do already. They didn't really need to go through all that. That's the whole point. They didn't need to try to trick him. And, God, these people are simply telling you what's going to happen. And so Esau's upset. And verse 38, Esau says to his father, "Hast thou but one blessing, my father?" Once he found out that Jacob had gotten his blessing. "Bless me, even me also, O my father." And Esau lifted up his voice and he wept. "I want to get blessed." But that, if you don't get that blessing, if you don't get prayed over, that doesn't stop God from doing it. And praying over some child doesn't make God bless them. It's just the idea of bring that person to the Lord, and you can maybe find out what's going to happen. But I'm telling you what's going to happen. Not, you're not making God do something just because you brought your child to the Lord and have them prayed over. There's still stuff that you got to do if you want that child to have a good life. And if that would never happen, if you were not christened, if no wise man laid their hands and prayed over you, that doesn't mean anything. God's still going to do what he's going to do. So he could have said to Esau, "God's still going to bless you. Don't worry about it just because you didn't get prayed over." But Esau's crying. So, verse 39, and Isaac his father answered and said unto him, "Okay, behold, I'm going to go ahead and pray for you." And he prayed this. He actually kind of prophesied the same thing he prophesied over Jacob, at least the first half. He says, "Thy dwelling shall be the fatness of the earth, and the dew of heaven from above. So you're going to just spread out. He said the very same thing to Jacob. Here's where it changed. Verse 40, and by the sword thou shalt live, and you will serve your brother. And it shall come to pass, however, so you are going to serve your brother, but God had already prophesied that when they were babies, right? And it shall come to pass when thou shalt have the dominion that thou shalt break his yoke from off thy neck. So you're going to switch it. You're going to serve him, but his yoke that's on you, you're going to break it and you're going to have the dominion. So roles are going to be switched. And listen to this. And it says, and Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing wherewith his father blessed him. Not knowing Jacob can't affect that. This is what is going to happen. That was already prophesied when they were little, when they were in the womb. So Jacob didn't steal anything from Esau. Nobody can steal what God has for you. What's going to happen? It's going to happen. I mean, God's just telling you, here's what's going to happen. And nobody can mess you up. Nobody can, oh, I would have had such a great life if it wasn't for so-and-so. If you're supposed to have a great life, you can still have one. Don't let anybody make you think that somebody has messed you up or you've missed it or, oh no, if only this had happened, I would have. No, nothing can thwart what God has for us. But here's the cool, interesting thing to me about this, because it says at a certain point, yeah, you're going to serve him. And Esau's line were the Edomites. They were the Edomites, and they lived kind of south of the Jews who were Jacob's line, right? They lived kind of south of Judah, the Edomites. For a while, they served them. In fact, now the Edomites, Esau's line were not Jews. They were related to the Jews. But, Jacob had those 12 kids, and one of them was Judah, of his 12 sons. And from Judah, we get the Jews. Really, and Esau was related to cousins to the Jews, but they weren't Jews. They weren't Jews. They were related to them. But at a certain point after when the Jews were carried off to captivity by the Babylonians, the Edomites were like, yay, get them, because they hated the Jews. They never got over it. Then later, when the Maccabees rebelled against the Greeks, the next generation forced the Edomites to become Jewish. They weren't really Jewish, but they forced them to. But they weren't Jew. They weren't from the line of Judah, but they had to practice the Jewish religion and doing that, right? Shortly thereafter, the Herodians, the Romans, come into power, and they see the Edomites, and they're all the Herodians. Herod, all them. They're the descendants of Esau. They put them in charge of the Jews. So Herod and his whole family, they're now in charge of the Jews, which is exactly what Jacob said. They're going to dominate you, but at some point you're going to dominate them. And so Herod's killing all the firstborn, right? Trying to find who Jesus is and killing John the Baptist. That's Esau's people. Which is what the dad said. You're going to have your day, but unfortunately it's going to be an angry day because you hate the Jews. You're so mad at Jacob because you think he stole something from you, which he didn't. And we're just like that. Oh man, you stole no, he didn't steal anything from you. And there was going to be a time that you were put over, your descendants are going to be put in charge of Jacob's descendants. And what are you going to do with that? Terrible stuff, because you're still angry, you're still mad, you still hate them. And so you're put over. And so the Herodian line, eventually was really screwed up because they had all this anger in them. There was a day when they were put in charge and they could have done marvelous, magnificent things with it, but their anger, thinking they had been left out, made them this angry group and made them enemies of Christ and enemies of the Jews. And what did that do for them? Okay, so anyway, here's my last example of really what God intends when they brought these children to Jesus. Remember that Hannah was praying for a child, and Hannah, when she got pregnant with Samuel, who was a prophet, right? She dedicated him to the Lord. Well, here's what she did. It's in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 27. It says, for this child I prayed, and the Lord had given me my petition, which I asked of him. So I wanted a child. So she takes him to the temple. She takes him, and it was her job to make sure he stayed in church. And verse 28 says, therefore also I have lent him to the Lord. And as long as he liveth, he shall be lent to the Lord. I'm going to make sure he's in the temple. I'm going to make sure he is reading the Bible. I'm going to make sure that he's doing what he's supposed to do. That's what a real baby dedication is, not about the baby. A baby dedication is about the parents dedicating themselves to give that baby a Christian education, to make sure that baby is raised up in the fear of the Lord. You dedicating your baby, or us dedicating our babies and having them christened or whatever, that's not some magic thing. The baby dedication is us dedicating ourselves to saying, I'm going to make sure that, because too many people bring their baby to the church, he's prayed over, and they go, oh, good, whoosh, that's taken care of. And then they just ignore him the rest of the time. And they think some magic thing happened. No, no. If you're not going to dedicate yourself like Hannah did and make sure that child is in church, then you wasted your time. And you just need to sit around and wait for the prophecy and, pray over my baby. Okay. Like, I'm going to pray like in the old days, and I'm going to look and tell you this baby's going to be a mess, or this baby's going to be blessed of God. Who knows? God knows. But if you want to assure that at least you've done your part, when we have a child, we have to make sure that child is brought up in the house of the Lord, and that we personally set good examples for them. We don't just send them to church and then they come home and we're drunk. We go with them to the church, and we sit with them in the Sunday school, and that we live that life as a good example. So they brought these children to Jesus, and what did the disciples do? Matthew chapter 19, verse 13, and the disciples rebuked them. Why are you bringing these children to Jesus? Because Jesus had just been talking about eunuchs. He'd just been saying eunuchs. And he says, he don't want no children. He just wants eunuchs. And the disciples, like, we make up doctrines. Jesus was talking about the eunuchs and they have to be dedicated to the Lord. But that doesn't mean everybody's supposed to be a eunuch. But that's what the disciples think. And that's what we think. We find one scripture. We think, oh, this is it. And we try to make the whole world fit that one scripture. No, even though Jesus had just been talking about eunuchs dedicated themselves to the Lord, and if you dedicate yourself to the Lord, but you can still bring children. Jesus is like, no, let the children come. That was a different topic. Calm down, disciples. Stop rebuking people. In Matthew chapter 19, verse 14, but Jesus says, no, suffer the little children and forbid them not to come unto me. Let them come. And we do how we do that in the church. You can't get saved until you're 12 or until you're 15. You don't forbid the children. He says they actually, the younger the better, because children believe. You don't wait till they're 15 to tell them about Santa Claus. You tell them about Santa Claus when they're 3. But you want to wait to tell them about Jesus until they're at the age of accountability or something. That doesn't make any sense. Children believe. And if you say there's a God up there that loves you and that he's providing for you, and we're going to ask Jesus to heal this person right now, children will believe. And that's why he had just told disciples, unless you become like these little children, you're not going to make it into little heaven. Because little children, they will believe, they'll be obedient. And he says we have to have that kind of heart. So don't forbid the children to come. That's the time you should be bringing them, because you can plant that seed in their heart. And if you train up a child the way he should go when he's young, when he's old, he won't depart from it. So don't forbid them. Bring them on in. Teach them and be an example. And we have to dedicate ourselves to their education. It's not just having them sprinkled. That won't save your child. But making sure they're getting the right education in the Lord, and that they're seeing us live it out, and that we become living examples, that'll do it. And verse 15 says, and he laid his hands on them, he prayed, and then he was out. He says, I'm out. And on that note, I'm done. So that is our lesson, Matthew chapter 19. And next week in our Wednesday Bible study, we go to Matthew chapter 20, and we're just scooting along in Matthew. We're doing well. In Genesis, we're still like on the 3rd chapter of Genesis. How is that possible? It's been 3 months. That's on Sunday. So if you want to tune in on Sundays at 10 a.m., I'll see you then. And for the rest of you, God bless you. I'll see you next week.